I first noticed the problem not in the tower, but in the emptiness that surrounds it. Devil's Tower rises from the plain with a shape the eye understands before the textbook arrives to correct it. A flat crown, long vertical sides, a mass that seems less built upward than cut short. We are told this is geology, and maybe it is. But the stump comparison is not the real disturbance. A stump is a remainder. It belongs to roots, trunks, canopy, damage, repetition. If this was only one surviving remnant, then the question is not what it was. The question is where everything else went. The official explanation has the advantage of completeness. It tells us what Devil's Tower is before the eye has time to finish asking what it resembles: an igneous intrusion, molten rock that cooled beneath the surface, softer surrounding material removed by erosion, columns formed as the mass contracted. A monument produced by pressure, cooling, time, and exposure. There is nothing weak about that explanation on its own terms. But official explanations often do more than describe. They also close the range of permitted comparison. Once the object is named, the mind is instructed to stop moving. The flat top becomes weathering. The long vertical sides become joints. The strange isolation becomes a triumph of erosion. The feeling that something has ended there, something once taller, once connected, once alive in a way the present landscape no longer admits, is treated as a mistake of perception. Maybe it is. I want to be precise about that. The stump resemblance does not prove a stump. It does not prove a forest. It does not overturn geology by itself. Nature repeats forms across unrelated systems. Rivers branch like veins. Lightning resembles roots. Crystals grow in patterns that feel biological without being alive. The world is full of visual echoes, but some echoes are harder to dismiss than others. Devil's Tower does not merely suggest height. It suggests interruption. Its sides fall in vertical bands with a discipline that feels less like broken rubble than hardened structure. Its crown is blunt enough that the mind imagines continuation above it, as though the visible mass were not the whole object, but the lower remainder of something removed. Stand below it, and the comparison does not arrive as fantasy first. It arrives as scale confusion. The body knows stumps. The eye recognizes terminated growth. Then the mind rejects the scale because the scale is not allowed. That rejection is understandable. A mountain-sized tree would require more than one strange tower. It would require a world. It would require conditions that no official history of the landscape preserves. It would require roots, remains, distribution, biological consequence. It would require not just one object, but the evidence of an ecology. That is where the question should begin. A stump is never a complete object. It is a remainder. It points downward into the ground, upward toward what is missing, outward toward branches that no longer exist, and sideways toward other trunks that once shared the same conditions. No one finds a stump in an empty field and concludes the story is finished. The stump is a fragment of a larger absence. It demands context. So if Devil's Tower is even permitted to resemble one, the real problem is not the tower. The real problem is the silence around it. Where are the neighboring forms? Where are the broken crowns? Where are the mineralized trunks lying across the old ground? Where are the root systems, the buried radial scars, the disturbances in the land that would show anchoring at impossible scale? Where is the debris of a canopy large enough to alter wind, light, soil, and water? Where is the repetition that every forest, even a ruined one, should leave behind? This is the point where the theory is usually dismissed, and it is the strongest point against it. If such a forest existed, one would expect traces, not perfect traces, not complete preservation. Geological time destroys, compresses, dissolves buries, and renames. But systems are harder to erase than single specimens. A forest is not one object. It is a distribution pattern. It leaves more than a silhouette. It leaves density. It leaves layering. It leaves damage repeated across space. Even when reduced to stone, coal, sediment, or mineral replacement, it should leave a logic behind. The absence of that logic matters, but absence is not always simple. It depends on what we have been trained to count as evidence. A root at the scale of a tree is recognizable because it remains within human expectation. A root at the scale of a ridge might be called a vein, a fault, a channel, a resistant structure, an erosional remnant. A trunk at the scale of a log can become petrified wood and remain safely biological. A trunk at the scale of a hill may leave the category altogether and enter geology before anyone asks whether the category was too small. We already accept the principle. Wood can become stone. Organic texture can survive mineral replacement. Ancient forests can be preserved, catalogued, fenced off, placed under glass, photographed, studied. Petrified forests are not fringe evidence. They are ordinary geology and ordinary paleontology, because their scale remains obedient to the word tree. The difficulty begins when scale breaks language. A petrified log on the ground can be accepted because it still belongs to the world our bodies understand. You can walk around it. You can see the rings. You can point to bark. You can explain preservation without threatening the size of the past. But if the same basic idea were enlarged beyond the human frame, the evidence might stop looking like biology and start looking like terrain. The object would not be refuted. It would be reassigned. That distinction matters more than it first appears. If the missing forest is searched for only in the form of recognizable trees, then perhaps it will always be missing. If roots must look like roots, trunks must look like trunks, and crowns must look like crowns, then the search is already limited to remains small enough to comfort the existing categories. Anything larger would be explained separately, one form as volcanic, another as erosional, another as sedimentary, another as structural. Each explanation might be locally coherent. The larger pattern would never be assembled. This does not prove that Devil's Tower was alive. It shows that the question has been narrowed before it is allowed to become difficult. The tower stands alone in the official imagination because it has been given a solitary explanation. The landscape around it is not asked to testify. Other formations are not invited into comparison. Similarities are treated as accidents unless they fit a category already approved. The eye notices repetition. The institution notices labels. And labels are powerful. They decide when resemblance is evidence and when resemblance is childishness. They decide when stone remembers life and when stone is only stone. They decide how far a comparison may travel before it becomes embarrassing. In that sense, the missing forest may not be a simple absence. It may be the result of a way of seeing that divides related clues before they can form a system. The first mystery is Devil's Tower. The deeper mystery is why the landscape around it has been made to answer only in separate pieces. The cleanest objection remains the most serious one. Maybe the forest is missing because there never was a forest. Maybe the tower resembles a stump only because the human mind completes familiar shapes from unfamiliar stone. Maybe the flat crown is only weathering. Maybe the vertical sides are only cooling joints. Maybe the surrounding emptiness is not suspicious at all, but exactly what erosion would leave after millions of years of patient removal. That possibility has to remain open. I am not claiming that every butte was a tree, or that every columned cliff is bark, or that every isolated plateau is the crown of something cut away. That would be too easy. It would turn the question into mythology before the evidence had a chance to become interesting. The point is narrower and more uncomfortable. What happens when possible evidence becomes too large for the category that would have made it recognizable? Classification decides what can be seen. A mesa is a mesa. A butte is a butte. A volcanic plug is a volcanic plug. Basalt columns are cooling fractures. Petrified wood belongs to ancient forests, only when the object remains small enough to preserve familiar signs. Rings, bark, logs, a fallen trunk, a cross-section, something the eye can reduce to the scale of a museum label. But what if scale is the mechanism of disappearance? A root system at ordinary scale is a root system. At monumental scale, it becomes terrain. It becomes a ridge, a mineral vein, a drainage pattern, a fault line, a buried disturbance no one is required to interpret biologically. A stump at ordinary scale is a stump. At monumental scale, it becomes a resistant mass, an exposed intrusion, a landmark of erosion. A fallen trunk becomes a long hill. A buried canopy becomes carbon, sediment, coal, or simply an irregular layer in a record already translated into geological language. Not hidden, translated. That is a different kind of disappearance. It does not require a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. It requires only categories strong enough to outlive the questions that might have challenged them. Once the name is applied, the object is stabilized. Students learn the name. Museums repeat the name. Maps print the name. Tour guides inherit the name. The public receives the name as the answer, not as the beginning of a comparison. And after enough repetition, the comparison starts to feel unserious. This is how a forest could vanish without being physically removed, not all at once, not through fire or flood or deliberate destruction. It could vanish by division. One fragment filed under volcanism, one under erosion, one under sediment, one under fossil wood, one under mineralization, one under myth. Each piece explained in isolation. Each explanation plausible enough to prevent the larger assembly. The forest would not disappear from the earth. It would disappear from the permitted pattern. Consider again the accepted petrified forests. Their existence proves that biological form can survive the passage into stone. It proves that wood can be mineralized, that organic structure can remain visible after life has gone, that a forest can become geology without becoming meaningless. But the accepted specimens remain obedient. They lie where we can measure them. They preserve rings we can photograph. They allow the past to be ancient without becoming impossibly large. The moment the scale changes, the permission changes with it. A log of stone is evidence. A mountain with stump-like geometry is imagination. A fossilized forest is science. A landscape that behaves like the ruins of one is speculation. The boundary is not only material, it is psychological. It is institutional. It is the point at which the word tree stops being allowed to travel with the evidence. I want to be precise. The official geological account may be correct. Devil's Tower may be exactly what the textbooks say it is. An exposed igneous body, shaped by cooling, uplift, erosion, and time. Nothing in this question automatically disproves that. But a process is not always the same as an origin. Cooling describes structure. Erosion describes exposure. Mineralization describes transformation. These words can explain what happened to matter without always exhausting what that matter once was. That distinction is rarely allowed to stand. Instead, the question is closed by confidence. No confirmed cellular structure at that scale. No accepted rings. No verified roots. No surrounding forest bed. No institutional need to compare Devil's Tower with forms placed in other categories. These are serious objections. They should be taken seriously. But seriousness should produce examination, not ridicule. Refutation leaves traces. A careful dismissal would compare forms across landscapes. It would ask what root systems at impossible scale should look like after mineral replacement. It would define the threshold at which biological geometry becomes geological coincidence. It would explain why certain shapes can resemble growth so precisely without carrying any memory of growth at all. It would leave papers, debates, diagrams, failed comparisons, documented reasons. What we usually get instead is a shorter movement. The idea is laughed out before it is investigated. The question is treated as evidence of ignorance. The person asking is corrected back into the category, and the object remains where it was, unchanged, patient, still producing the same forbidden comparison in anyone who looks long enough before being told what not to see. That is why Devil's Tower matters, even if the Stump theory is wrong. It exposes the speed with which perception is disciplined. It shows how quickly resemblance can be permitted in jokes, postcards, and casual speech, but forbidden as a serious line of inquiry. It shows that the landscape is not simply read, it is taught. And what is taught is not only what an object is, but what it may never be compared to. So where are the forests? Maybe they were never there. Maybe the whole disturbance begins and ends with a shape that happens to resemble something familiar. That answer is possible. It may even be correct. But if it is correct, the confidence surrounding it should be able to survive the question. It should not need the question to be embarrassing. Or maybe the forests are not absent in the simple sense. Maybe their traces were scattered into names. Maybe their roots became ridges. Their trunks became towers. Their crowns became mesas. Their fallen bodies became long mineral masses. Their remains divided across disciplines that never had to speak to one another. Maybe the forest is missing because the word forest was removed from the scale at which it would have mattered. We do not have the answer. We have an object that looks like an ending. We have a landscape that refuses to supply the beginning. We have categories confident enough to separate every fragment before a pattern can form. And we have the strange persistence of a comparison that survives every correction. The tower still stands. The columns still descend. The crown still ends too bluntly for the mind to ignore. The surrounding land still feels less empty than edited. Somewhere in that silence, the old question waits. Not proof, not fantasy, a witness. The algorithm, of course, would prefer the forest stayed ridiculous.